Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Menor. And today's Wednesday, that is Comic Book Day. That means it's the world's finest team up between my channel and Steve Donoghue's channel. Every week on our channels, we will talk about a certain comic book subject, graphic novel, or just comic book thing. And this week, we are talking about The Savage Sword of Conan, which was a fantastic black and white comic book magazine that ran initially in the 70s. This ran from August 1974 through July 1995. So this comic book lasted a while. It had 235 issues, this comic book, or comic magazine, I should say. It was a black and white comic book. And this is the 8th issue, which I'm just holding up as an example. Usually start off, you would have an illustration on the inside cover. The table of contents pretty much always looked like that. Usually you would have 2 or 3 stories an issue, all in black and white. Usually the artwork was great, usually. You'd have a lot of cool advertisements in there for their other magazines. And they were just fantastic. They told great Conan stories, as well as some backup features that featured some of Robert E. Howard's other great characters like Kull and Solomon Kane, comic book stories on those characters. Bran McMorn, the Pictish King, he had some comic book stories in these. So these were really great. So back in the 70s, Stan Lee was really anxious to compete with Warren, who was publishing black and white comic book magazines like Eerie and Creepy, and I think they did Vampirella. And Stan Lee wanted to compete against those comic books. He wanted his own line of black and white comic magazines, where he would not be reined in by the Comics Code Authority. He could do more mature stories. Mature usually meant some of the women were topless sometimes or naked. The stories themselves usually weren't that mature. But you can get away with a lot more, basically. And they came out with an initial line of black and white magazines. The first one they came out with, I believe, was this magazine, Savage Tales. This came before Savage Sword of Conan. Now this is Conan the Barbarian starring in Savage Tales. Conan was a hit in his color comic book, and he seemed like a great character that they can make more mature stories about. So they came out with this issue of Savage Tales, which was a curiosity. First of all, you had this weird John Buscema cover. But this was a pretty cool issue. Rated M for mature. It wasn't rated. They just put that in there to help sell the comic book, I think. Rated M for the mature reader. And this had a number of stories in it. The Conan story in here was excellent. This is a Barry Windsor Smith, a Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor Smith adapt The Frost Giant's Daughter. And the artwork in this is brilliant. It's just a great, great Conan story. And it was reprinted a few different times. I think they even reprinted it in the color version of the Conan comic book. But it was excellent. The artwork was just dynamite in this Conan story. So that story alone proved that this was a good idea. This did have some oddities in this particular issue. This had The Theory of the Femizons by Stan Lee and John Romita. Artwork was really good. It's this weird science fiction story about the future world where women rule and run around with swords and men are all slaves. And it was ridiculous. Oddly enough, we never get a sequel to the Femizons. Can't imagine why. It was absurd. Now, this issue also had the initial Man-Thing story. Man-Thing was Marvel's Swamp Thing, only weirder. And so that was cool. That was in this issue. This also had a very weird story called Black Brother. Black Brother by Sergius O'Shaughnessy was the writer. That was Denny O'Neil. That was his clever alias. But the artwork was by Gene Colan, and the artwork was great. The story, not so much. So we never hear of Black Brother again. But the artwork was really good by Gene Colan. He usually did a great job. We also have a Khazar story. Khazar was a character that Marvel used as their version of Tarzan, basically. He existed in a Edgar Rice Burroughs-y Lost World. Only Khazar, at least as Stan Lee wrote him, was lame. It was just, this story is terrible. All the Khazar stories that Stan Lee wrote that I've ever read are terrible. The artwork was by John Buscema here, so the artwork was really good. But the story itself was terrible. So this had some mixed success because a lot of the stories were just not great, but the Man-Thing was kind of cool and the Conan was excellent. So a mixed start, but it did sell. So after a couple of months, Savage Tales came back. And after about 5 issues of this, Conan got his own spot. There were a few different black and white magazines that Marvel did. A lot of them were horror or monster comic books. You had Dracula Lives, which was pretty good. It was one of the best. Then you had Tales of the Zombie, which was also pretty good in its own way. You had Vampire Tales. You had The Haunt of Horror. You had Monsters Unleashed. So you had all of those. Some of those were better than others. I'm going to talk about all of the Marvel horror comic books all in one episode, and I can tell you how great they were, and Steve Donoghue will tell you how terrible they were, and that'll be fun. Out of the black and white comics, other than Savage Sword of Conan, the best ones were, oddly, Planet of the Apes. This was excellent. This was an excellent magazine, and it was for most of its run. And Unknown Worlds of Science Fiction, which was great. Only lasted, I think, 5 issues, maybe 6. But it was great, man. I wish I had some of these issues because they were just fantastic. And they'll probably never be reprinted. But they were awesome. A lot of the issues of Savage Sword are reprinted in Omnibus volumes now. There are 6 of these so far at the time of filming. And these reprint all of the initial Savage Tales issues and the first issues of Savage Sword of Conan. I don't have a copy of the first issue of Savage Sword of Conan. I wish I did, but it looked just like this. This is the reprint in the Omnibus volume. And the Omnibuses are great because they do a great job reprinting these issues. They look fantastic. Every Conan story and most of the articles and some of the backup stories too are reprinted in this omnibus. And the initial story in this issue was really cool. Has Red Sonja in it. Excellent issue. And also reprints the Frost Giant's daughter again, just for anyone who missed it, I guess. The second issue has a Neil Adams cover there. Has artwork by John Buscema and Alfred Alcala, and you get a lot of that. Now you'll notice right away in these issues that it doesn't look like a regular John Buscema issue because Alfred Alcala really does a lot of shading and line work, which works really well when reproduced in black and white. It gives it a depth that's really interesting, and the artwork is really, really good. John Buscema was not thrilled with the inking because he thought it was too ornate, it wasn't in his style, and he thought it was a little overdone, to say the least. And he has a point. It can be a little overdone. It ends up sometimes looking a lot more Alcala than it does John Buscema, but I still think it looked really good. So yeah, this omnibus here is the first one. This has the first 5 issues of Savage Tales that I just showed you, and Savage Sword of Conan 1 through 12. So this is really cool. And I have a few issues that I'll just throw up here just so you can get a look at them. I love this cover. This is Earl Norham. Let me make sure I'm right. Yeah, this is an Earl Norham cover, and just look at that. He was a great cover artist. He did a lot of the Marvel magazine covers, and they were beautiful. Everything he did was beautiful for the most part. Usually a lot better sometimes on the monster books than what you got inside. But yeah, he was great, and he was great on Savage Sword of Conan. This issue actually, this is issue 14. This has a Neil Adams story in it, which is mostly good. And this one has what backup feature? It just has, let me see if I can give you, this is an example of one of their articles. This one about Worms of the Earth, I think, which was a book that was published at that time, that they have a little review about. So that was cool. Here's another issue. This is issue number 17. Another pretty cool cover there. Now this one has, first of all, how iconic is that image by John Buscema? That is just an iconic, beautiful image of Conan. And this again has Alfred Alcala on John Buscema, and you can see some of that really intricate line work that Buscema was not thrilled with, but I think looked, for the most part, pretty good. It could be overdone, but it does look really good in black and white. I imagine this might not reproduce as well in color, but in a black and white comic book, it looked pretty good. There's brooding Conan there. And I read a lot of these issues when I was a kid. And this Conan, John Buscema's Conan, he's always Conan for me. When I picture Conan in my head, it's John Buscema's Conan. And a lot of the artwork in this is just fantastic. Got the first annual here. The annuals tended to do reprints. And so this annual just has some reprints of, it reprints a Barry Windsor Smith story that was already in the color comic book. They just do a black and white version of that story, which reproduces pretty good. The backup story is a King Kull story. Annuals usually had reprints. What issue is this? This is number 19. A lot of the earlier issues were pretty great. This has the conclusion of People of the Black Circle. Again, some of that beautiful Alcala art, Alcala inked John Buscema art. Really excellent. I have to say that the black and white Savage Sword of Conan was, in my mind, better than the color comic book, as much as I liked it. I think the stories in Savage Sword were just better. Something about them was just cooler, and it looked better, and they can have more room for the stories, and it was just an excellent, excellent comic. What a great series this was, and it lasted a long, long time. I have one of the later issues here. This is issue 170. That is a Joe Jusko cover, I believe. One of the later ones. Have the illustration on the back. They looked a little different on the inside at this point, but they still had that inside illustration, and they still had, that's the contents page there. Fewer pages in these later stories, but at this point, Chuck Dixon was doing the stories. And who illustrated this one? Gary Quapiz? Have no idea who that was. But again, this is a very Savage Sword scene there. And it was still good. Even at 170 issues. And again, like I said, it went to 235. But eventually at 235, I don't have those 90s, those mid-90s issues of this, unfortunately. So I don't have the final issue to show you. One thing that's interesting is that in the 90s, the black and white line had pretty much died off. Here's an advertisement. This will show you that there's only 4 black and white comic books at this point in the, this is 89. But at this point, they only had Savage Sword of Conan. They had a Punisher. They had the Destroyer, which was a magazine based off the pulpy paperback Destroyer books. And they had Conan Saga, which was a reprint magazine that reprinted the earlier Savage Sword of Conan. So I've got one here. So this would be like the original Savage Sword of Conan issue number 42 with a great cover there. And this is Conan Saga, which just reprints it. So this is from the 90s, which reprints this issue from the 70s. And then eventually, for whatever reason, Savage Sword of Conan died out. It was canceled. But oddly, hard upon its cancellation, this came out. This is Conan the Savage, which is another black and white Conan magazine. This didn't last too long. This only lasted, I believe, 10 issues. Yeah, it lasted 10 issues. I don't think there was an 11th. But this, again, was a black and white comic book. Chuck Dixon, who was doing the Savage Sword of Conan stories, does it. Alcatina does the artwork for the initial Conan story, and it was great. He did an excellent job on these initial Conan stories, these Conan stories he did for Conan the Savage. I don't know why they just didn't call it Savage Sword of Conan, but Conan the Savage, the successor to Savage Sword of Conan. One difference is that by this point there were no articles. It was just a couple comic book stories per issue. And like I said, this only lasted 10 issues. The final issue is right here. Now there is something that is appropriate about this issue, and that is the final story in the final black and white magazine that Marvel Comics did is a story by Roy Thomas and John Buscema. And this is the sequel to their graphic novel Conan of the Isles, which was based on Bradley Camp and Lynn Carter's novel. So chronologically in Conan's career, this is the end, right? And so this final story that Roy Thomas and John Buscema did is chronologically the last Conan story in the Conan series, which is kind of appropriate when you consider that this is the final issue of a black and white Conan magazine. And the final scene in this, the final panel, Conan has given up his crown of Aquilonia and is here heading out on another adventure. He's just continuing his adventures after he has given up being king. He's here on a ship, and he's going to go out on further adventures. And there's something just really appropriate about this. This is a great ending for Marvel's initial run of Conan stories. I really like this a lot, that it ended this way, and with John Buscema and Roy Thomas doing the story. So it was an appropriate ending in Conan the Savage, which was basically the Savage Sword of Conan. Hopefully they'll reprint Conan the Savage in the omnibuses. The latest omnibus that they have is this one. This one just came out recently as of this filming. This is volume 6, and it has Savage Sword of Conan 73 through 87. And it also has something really, really cool in this, which I was really, really happy to see when I got it the other day. This has the Conan the Barbarian Marvel Super Special, where they do the adaptation of the movie Conan. And this is cool for a couple reasons. One is that John Buscema does the artwork, and he doesn't even bother trying to make any of the characters look like they do in the movie. This is straight up John Buscema's Conan that he normally does. So all the characters in this movie adaptation just look like his regular Conan work. and it's beautiful. He does a beautiful job in this comic, and it's reproduced wonderfully here. And one of the things that I was happy about when I saw that was it's nostalgia for me, because I remember when I was a kid, I bought that Marvel Super Special with the movie story in it by John Buscema. I remember buying it at 7-Eleven, a convenience store a couple blocks from my house. And I remember walking home with that issue, and I was reading it on the way home as a kid. And every kid who saw me walking home ran up to me. And so I ended up with this gang of like 30 kids surrounding me, all wanting to take a look at this Marvel Super Special. Because everybody wanted to see this movie, and the Super Special came out before the movie did, or before any of us had a chance to see the movie anyway. And I remember this huge crowd of kids all wanting to see my Super Special, and how I barely made it out of this pack and home in one piece with my magazine. Everybody just wanted to see it. Everybody was excited for that film. It was interesting. And it's kind of a fun memory to think back on. I wonder what happened to that Marvel Super Special. I lost it at some point. So I was really happy to get this and to get that story again and to look at it and remember what it was like as a kid when that came out. And that's kind of how I feel about Savage Sword of Conan. You know, it's nostalgia, but it was also great work. I'm glad they're reprinting these, because I don't have every issue, obviously, of this magazine. I have a pretty good pile of them, but I don't have all of them. So I'm glad that Marvel is reprinting them in those omnibus issues. And I guess that's all I have to say about the Savage Sword of Conan. Tune in to Steve Donoghue's channel to see what he has to say about it. I will catch you next time here at Stately Fawn Manor.